Hello and welcome to the Mr. Brown podcast, where I reflect on my ongoing experiences as a teacher, with a special focus on mental health. I am your host, James Brown. Salutations. Another episode today with a focus on behaviour. I didn't plan it this way. So what I usually do with these episodes is I look back over my reflections for the past few weeks and pick out some things that I'd like to discuss on the podcast. And it just so happens today that each of the three things I'd like to discuss do relate in some way or other to the issue of behaviour management. So, the first thing today, and I should also say, many of these things have been the result of some brilliant conversations that I've been having with my mentee in my mentor meetings. So, again, being a trainee teacher is brilliant. Wonderful contribution. Great conversations with more experienced teachers. Really gets us thinking. So thank you to all the trainees out there. Now, the first thing. Many trainees come into the profession with very high behavioural standards, and rightly so. That's what we need. We need trainees with high behavioural standards. However, to begin with, their ability to enforce those standards might not be there. So they've got very high standards, but their ability to make sure those standards actually manifest in classrooms might be much lower. So their ability has got some catching up to do. And that's absolutely fine. You know, if you came into the profession with all of the behaviour management tools already in place, that would be quite exceptional. So yeah, it's usual for trainees to have high behavioural standards, but for their ability to enforce those standards to be much lower. And it will catch up with time and practice and patience, heaps of patience. Your ability to enforce your standards will indeed catch up. And that's what should happen. What shouldn't happen is that you lower your behavioural standards to meet your ability to enforce those standards. That shouldn't happen. That's the wrong way around. And I should say as well, this isn't an issue that affects only trainee teachers. It could affect any teacher with a new class or a tricky class or a teacher in a new school. So whenever a teacher is in a situation where their ability to enforce their high behavioural standards might be lagging behind a little bit, it's important not to lower the standards to meet the ability, but rather to persevere, be patient, start investing in relationships with students, and soon enough the ability to enforce the standards will catch up with the standards, the high standards themselves. That's the right way around. Because as we've discussed on the podcast a few times now, it's all too easy to allow some students to start chipping away at your standards. It's called salami slicing tactics. So you start off with this whole salami, which you're not planning to give away to anyone. But over time, people or students, just take a slice here and there, barely even noticeable. Okay. In fact, sometimes you might say, okay, you can have that slice, but as long as I've got the salami here, I've got the lion's share of the salami, you can have that little slice. But if that happens for long enough, all of a sudden, you haven't got a salami anymore. And students are very good at doing this. Some students, very good. They're natural salami slicers. They see how far they can push the boundaries, see how much they can chip away at the standards. And so, yes, a teacher, especially a new teacher or a trainee teacher, could indeed be forgiven for lowering their behavioural standards to meet their ability to enforce those standards. But my message today is just it's important to persevere, to keep the standards high. It's a situation where you're measuring short-term expediency against, long-term sustainable behavior management. Like, it might be easier in the short term to give a little ground, but in the long term, it can be counterproductive, and it can be better to suffer a bit of pain with behavior management and have those battles initially with those challenging students, so that in the long term, the behavior can really improve. And I say battles, that's obviously quite pejorative. It has a negative connotation, but sometimes by really engaging with these challenging students, that's actually one way in which you can show the student that you care about them. Some teachers, and perhaps some other people in their lives, just might not bother. In fact, that might be part of the reason why their behaviour is challenging in the first place. But if you really engage with them, if you say, no, these are my standards, and I do expect you to meet them because I care about you being the best version of you that you can be, and I know you can be brilliant. So that it is conflict in a way, but it's almost, if it's framed properly, it can convey actually a great deal of care to the student. And that hopefully can result in the more sustainable, positive changes that we're hoping to see. And I should also say that those, battles or conversations that I just mentioned are far better had privately rather than having a public argument in front of the rest of the class. They rarely end well. If a challenging student does start to explode in a lesson in front of all the other students, I think one way in which I try to deal with this, I'm not saying it's the perfect way, but it seems to be okay for me, is I'll say not now, later. So I'm not shutting it down completely. I'm saying that I will listen to you. I will listen to what you have to say. We will have this conversation, but we can't have it right now. And that seems to be better than just saying, don't argue with me, or just trying to dismiss it and shut it down completely. So there you go. Now, still on the topic of standards, and this very much relates to what I was just saying. It's very important to have high behavioural standards and to fight to keep those standards where they are, and not to give a single slice of salami, because all of a sudden you'll be left without a salami. But what if you have a student who is very challenging, and in a particular lesson, they are failing to meet your high behavioural standards, but by their own standards, so compared to how they behave usually, they're actually having quite a good lesson. So I'm thinking of the sort of student who can be very disruptive, distract others, argue back. The sort of student who can make teaching a class difficult. And say that part of your expectations at the start of a lesson is that dates and titles are written in a timely fashion and underlined, and students crack on with the starter in silence. So this is one of my expectations that I do my best to enforce. But you've got this really challenging student who perhaps might even have been kicked out of the lesson the past 2 or even 3 lessons. They're that sort of student. However, on this occasion, they've come in, they haven't done anything too disruptive at the start of the lesson. They've gotten their pencil case and planner out. They've even opened their book, and it looks like they've started to get in the date and the title. But there might still be a little bit of talking with the person next to them. However, compared to what they're usually like, they are having an exceptional lesson. They're being really good by their own standards. And moreover, you can see they're making an effort. So they haven't quite met your high behavioural standards. They're not quite working in silence. That date and title isn't quite yet written in, but it looks like it's about to be written in. And yes, by their own standards, they're doing really well. They're really trying. But what do you do? Because they haven't met your standards. They might be trying, but they're still not quite there. So what do? You could let it slide. You could give away that slice of salami because they have made some steps in the right direction. But what message does that send to the rest of the class? So if there are other students in the class who are behaving like this student in this particular lesson, and you would have already by now given them a consequence because they have been talking to other people, for example, what message does it send to those students if for this really challenging student who's making an effort today and has made some improvements, what message does it send if you don't give them the same consequence or the same sanction? So it's the perennial problem of differential treatment again. And I don't know the answer. So I spoke to my trainee about this earlier in the week because this issue did come up. I said that it's really, and I wasn't happy with this response really. I said that it's really important to maintain your high behavioural standards, to not give away an inch, not give away a single slice of salami. But for some students, sometimes, if they're really making an effort to do the right thing, even if they still aren't quite meeting your high standards, if they're really making an effort, then maybe it's okay every once in a while to bend the standards, not lower them, not break them, but to bend the standards a little bit. And that was a stupid thing to say, wasn't it? I don't know what that means. But it's a dilemma. It's a real dilemma for teachers. I have a very experienced colleague. Well, she's retired now, but I think she was a real expert at navigating these sorts of situations, and she was a behaviour management superstar. She would have a lot of success with all of those really difficult boys. And I think if I had to think about what she would do in that situation, I think she'd go over to the student in question and she would acknowledge the effort that they are making and say that they're having a really good lesson, much better than last lesson. You're doing really well. I can see you're really trying. And she'd remind them to hurry up and get the date and title written in and underlined and to remain silent. So she'd gee them up. She'd go and acknowledge the effort that was being put in, acknowledge the progress, and just take that also as an opportunity to remind them of the standards and that they, even though they're trying really hard and they are having a good lesson, they're still just a little bit behind. Give them a bit of a nudge and just say, come on, quickly, let's get this done. So I think that's important. Acknowledging effort where effort is being made is important. Even if from the outside observer's point of view, the student still isn't doing what you're asking them to do, not to the letter anyway, but because you understand the student, that in fact, in this lesson, they're having a good lesson and they're really trying, they're making an effort. It's really important to acknowledge that effort. But at the same time, to not let your standards slip. So it's a dilemma. It really is. I'd be very interested to hear how you navigate this real problem of behaviour management. Okay, one more thing to discuss today, but first, my usual Patreon plea. This episode took around 2 hours to produce, and that's about average, and I aim to produce 2 episodes a month. So if you think that work is worth at least the price of a coffee, so £2 to £3, once a month, then please consider signing up on the Patreon. And if you do sign up, you'll be helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. It doesn't cost a lot to produce, but any contribution would be greatly appreciated. And you will also gain exclusive early access to videos of my recording sessions. As always, the link will be in the show notes below. Thank you very much. Okay, final thing I want to discuss today was an experience I had recently with my top set Year 11s. Again, it relates to behaviour management, I think, but in a slightly different way. We were doing some revision for an upcoming trial exam, a trial GCSE exam, and they were working on some revision questions. And I noticed that a student hadn't attempted a particular question. He'd skipped it. And this is an ongoing battle I'm having with my students, my Year 11 students. I keep telling them that this late into Year 11, there is no time left to be skipping questions. There is no guarantee that that question, that topic is going to reappear in a lesson and you're suddenly going to understand it. If you don't understand a question, if you feel tempted to skip it, you need to address this gap in your knowledge immediately by asking me, by doing something. We shouldn't be skipping questions this late into the GCSE year. That's what I keep telling students. Anyway, I looked over, the student had skipped a question. And I asked him, why have you skipped that question? He said, I don't understand. Also, I was already a little bit irritated because I think he might also have been messing around a little bit with the lad behind him anyway. So I said, why have you skipped that question? He said, I don't understand it. And I said, well, why haven't you asked me? If you don't understand a question, it's so important that we're not skipping these questions. Why haven't you asked me how to do it? I'm here to help you. And he said something that stuck with me. He said that he hadn't asked me because I was scary. And I'm not sure why it stuck with me. It's interesting. I thought I'd unpack it a little bit. Now, I think he probably doesn't find me that scary. Because like I said, he might have been messing around with the student behind him. And he does do that sort of thing every so often. And I'd have thought that if he found me scary, he wouldn't do that. So maybe it was just a deflection. But on the other hand, maybe I am scary. I said to him something along the lines of, well, when we encounter something scary, then that gives us an opportunity to practice being brave. You know, you become brave by doing and overcoming scary things. So even though you might be afraid to ask me, you still need to ask me, because I'm sure being a brave person is the sort of person that you want to be. So, you know, fear be damned. I mean, I didn't say that, but that's kind of that's what I was getting at. Regardless of your fear, you should ask me anyway, because it's important to make sure we fill these gaps in your knowledge. I said something along those lines. And I'm not sure how happy with that response I was. You know, I was taken aback a little bit at being called a scary teacher. I don't think I've ever been called scary before. And I think that if the result of being a scary teacher is that your students don't ask you questions when they don't understand something, then it's very, very bad. It's a very bad thing to be a scary teacher. Some teachers seem to aspire to being scary because the scary ones seem to have fewer behaviour management issues. If they can scare a whole class into working silently for an hour, then that looks great from the outside, doesn't it? But if the students are too frightened to ask questions when they don't understand something, then, well, being scary is a real problem. So what do you do? I'm not sure. I'm not sure what I'm going to do about the thought of being a scary teacher. I think I need to try to, with that class, I need to try to reduce the scariness in general of asking questions, because they're very bright. And I think often when you've got very, very clever students, quite a large part of their identity rests on the fact that they are clever. You know, they're invested in the fact that they're clever. And so asking a question which might suggest that you don't understand something could almost threaten their own sense of identity. They don't want to be seen by their peers as not understanding something. So it can be scary, perhaps, to ask a question. And especially even more scary if you also find your teacher to be scary for whatever reason. So I think in that class, I need to just bring down the scariness of asking questions. I think I'll try to do more one-to-one discussions during circulation. I mean, that happens already, but I'll try to do more of it because students might be more likely to ask me those questions one-to-one. I'll see how it goes. But yes, have you ever been described as a scary teacher? Do you think it's good or bad to be a scary teacher? I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. My initial reaction was that it's bad to be a scary teacher and that I should try to do something to be less scary. Would that be your reaction too? I'd be interested to hear. Thank you for listening today. And we will talk again in a few weeks' time. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word in person and on social media. You can follow me on Twitter @MrBrownPod or email mrbrownpod@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate and review in your directory of choice. Please also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/MrBrownPod and helping me cover the cost of producing the podcast. Thank you, and talk again soon.